What if the global economic order we take for granted is not stable at all, but quietly slipping into a stage that past civilizations would immediately recognize as the point of no return? Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the patterns shaping your life today are the same patterns that once pushed empires like Rome, Mali, the Ottomans, and the Soviet Union into irreversible decline. It sounds dramatic, but when you look closely at the six-stage economic cycle that is silently repeated across cultures and centuries, a disturbing clarity emerges. And the unsettling part is that every global indicator suggests we are collectively standing inside stage 4 right now, the most decisive and unstable point of the entire cycle. Stage 4 is the turning point where pressure builds, currencies weaken, social trust fractures, and geopolitical competition moves from subtle to aggressive. You can see these signals spreading through global markets, regional conflicts, and the silent unraveling of economic structures that once felt untouchable. The fascinating question is not whether the pattern is real, but how it keeps resurfacing in different places, from Mexico to Sudan to Tunisia, always following the same rhythm, as if history were trying to warn us through repetition. And when you trace the data, the speeches of world leaders, and the shifts in international alliances, the cycle becomes impossible to ignore. It feels less like an abstract theory and more like a mechanism silently governing the rise and fall of nations. As we move deeper into this investigation, understanding these repeating stages becomes essential, not only to predict what comes next, but to recognize the invisible forces shaping everything around us. Have you ever looked at current events and felt that something bigger was happening behind the scenes? What you're about to see might reshape the way you interpret global news, economic tensions, and the future of power itself. You can share your thoughts in the comments, because your perspective helps expand this conversation. And make sure to like this video and check if you are already subscribed, so you do not miss what comes next in this unfolding pattern, because the next insights may surprise you. And as we continue from here, the deeper layers of this cycle start revealing themselves in ways that connect past and present with uncanny precision. As we move further into this exploration, the idea of recurring economic cycles becomes less a coincidence and more a structural pattern etched into the very foundation of human societies. When historians, economists, and geopolitical analysts examine long arcs of development, they often notice that nations do not rise or fall in random sequences. Instead, they follow a recognizable trajectory driven by expansion, overreach, fragmentation, and eventual renewal. This rhythm appears in ancient empires, medieval kingdoms, colonial powers, and contemporary nation-states, suggesting that the forces shaping economies today are not new, but embedded in how humans build and manage complex systems. Throughout history, periods of prosperity tend to create the conditions for their own undoing. Abundant resources encourage population growth, innovation, and expansion, but they also invite complacency, mismanagement, and power concentration. As infrastructure strengthens and wealth accumulates, societies begin to shift their priorities from survival to influence, often stretching their capabilities beyond sustainable limits. This gradual imbalance sets the stage for internal and external pressures that push the system toward instability. It is this cyclical nature of strength turning into vulnerability that makes the study of economic patterns so revealing. Looking at the historical timeline, you can see these cycles unfold with remarkable consistency. After a phase of consolidation and rapid growth, nations tend to enter a period where their economic models begin to strain under increasing demands. High productivity gives way to stagnation, public services weaken, inequality rises, and political conflicts intensify. Trade networks that once guaranteed stability start to fracture, currencies lose purchasing power, and alliances shift as competing powers sense an opportunity to gain ground. The repetition of these signals is what allows analysts to categorize the journey of nations into sequential phases, each leading logically to the next. The intriguing part is that societies rarely notice when they are transitioning from one stage to another. People living through the shift interpret the tension as temporary disruption rather than structural transformation. Yet, when the pattern is examined from a broader perspective, the signs become unmistakable. Historical cycles reveal that economies do not collapse suddenly. They erode gradually, shaped by accumulated decisions, ignored warnings, and shifts in global dynamics that amplify existing weaknesses. And as we continue to trace these stages, the alignment between past and present becomes increasingly difficult to overlook, opening the door to a deeper understanding of where the current global system may be heading next. As this pattern becomes clearer, the logic behind the six-stage economic cycle starts to reveal its deeper structure. Each stage is not an isolated event, but a consequence of the one before it, forming a chain of cause and effect that guides nations through predictable transformations. The cycle begins with rebuilding and stabilization, when societies emerge from crises or periods of fragmentation. In this first phase, institutions strengthen, currencies regain credibility, and the focus is on restoring order and trust. It is a moment defined by discipline, long-term planning, and cautious optimism, laying the foundation for the prosperity that follows. When this stability matures, nations naturally enter the second stage, a period of rapid expansion. Productivity rises, innovation accelerates, and global trade connections become stronger. This is the moment when economic confidence peaks, attracting foreign investment and encouraging ambitious infrastructure projects. The sense of opportunity fuels both economic and cultural growth, creating a momentum that seems unstoppable. Yet this expansion also plants the seeds for the next stage, as rising complexity demands increasingly sophisticated management, and the balance between growth and sustainability becomes fragile. The third stage emerges when the system begins to strain under its own weight. Resources that once felt abundant start to tighten, financial models become more fragile, and governments face growing pressure to maintain living standards. Debt accumulates as leaders attempt to preserve the illusion of uninterrupted progress, even as productivity plateaus. Social divisions widen, debates intensify, and political actors shift from cooperation to competition. This stage represents the tipping point where the trajectory of a nation can no longer be maintained through the same strategies that once guaranteed its rise. What makes these first three stages so important is how seamlessly they transition into the next phase. By the time a society reaches this point, the vulnerabilities created by previous successes become impossible to ignore. Economic systems begin to show cracks. Geopolitical rivals take advantage of weakening positions, and internal tensions make decisive action increasingly difficult. And while people may sense that the environment is changing, the full impact of this shift does not become evident until the next stage begins to unfold with unmistakable force. As the cycle advances into stage 4, the shift becomes impossible to ignore, even for those who prefer to believe that economic turbulence is temporary. This phase is where the accumulated tensions of the previous stages finally surface, revealing vulnerabilities that were hidden beneath years of growth, optimism, and institutional confidence. Stage 4 is the moment when the system stops expanding and begins to fracture under competing pressures. Currency instability becomes more pronounced, public trust erodes, productivity slows, and governments respond with increasingly aggressive measures to maintain the appearance of stability. It is not collapse, but the unmistakable prelude to one. What distinguishes stage 4 from earlier phases is the convergence of internal and external stressors. Internally, societies face political polarization, rising dissatisfaction, and disputes over how resources should be allocated. Externally, global rivals sense weakness and begin to reposition themselves, accelerating geopolitical tension. Trade partnerships shift, supply chains falter, and financial markets react with volatility that exposes deeper structural weaknesses. At this point, nations often attempt to mask their fragility through short-term fixes like excessive borrowing, currency manipulation, or populist strategies that promise relief but intensify long-term risks. The most revealing aspect of stage 4 is how predictable it becomes when viewed through historical parallels. Empires and modern nations alike have reached this phase with strikingly similar symptoms. The Ottoman Empire attempted reforms that came too late to reverse its decline. The Soviet Union faced unsustainable economic strain that pushed it toward fragmentation. Even fast-growing economies in recent decades, once celebrated as unstoppable, encountered stage 4 pressures that exposed how quickly momentum can turn into stagnation. These examples highlight that the cycle is not unique to any region or era. It is a universal pattern tied to the limits of growth and the consequences of accumulated imbalance. In the present day, the world shows nearly all the indicators associated with this phase. Social trust is weakening, global tensions are intensifying, inflation has become a persistent challenge, and political systems struggle to address complex problems. These signals create an environment where uncertainty becomes the norm, not the exception. And yet, within this uncertainty lies the clarity of a pattern that has repeated throughout history, pointing toward the next stages with unsettling consistency. Before we move deeper, share in the comments what signs of stage 4 you have noticed around you, or which historical parallels seem most revealing in your view, because these observations help expand the understanding of where this cycle may lead next. As these signals become more visible on the global stage, recent examples offer a clear window into how stage 4 unfolds in real time. Countries like Mexico, Sudan, and Tunisia illustrate the different expressions of the same underlying pattern, shaped by their unique histories, but driven by the same economic pressures. Mexico, for instance, shows how a nation can balance between growth and fragility, experiencing moments of expansion while dealing with structural issues that prevent long-term stability. Rising public debt, reliance on external markets, and internal political pressures create an environment where the appearance of progress coexists with deep vulnerabilities. The result is a delicate equilibrium that can shift quickly when global conditions change. Sudan presents a more intense form of stage 4, where internal conflict, currency collapse, and geopolitical competition intersect to create chronic instability. Economic strain weakened national institutions long before the most recent crises erupted, and once those pressures became too heavy, the system moved rapidly toward fragmentation. Food shortages, rising prices, loss of public trust, and the intervention of foreign actors accelerated the cycle's progression. Sudan's experience demonstrates how quickly an economy can unravel when foundational structures are already weakened and external pressures intensify at the wrong moment. Tunisia offers yet another perspective. After a period of optimism driven by political transformation and international support, underlying economic weaknesses resurfaced with force. High unemployment, growing public dissatisfaction, weakened currency, and mounting fiscal pressure created conditions typical of stage 4. Despite attempts to reform and stabilize the system, the country found itself trapped between competing priorities, unable to sustain growth while managing rising social tension. Tunisia's trajectory serves as a reminder that even nations with the promise of renewal can struggle to escape the structural traps that define this stage of the cycle. Across these 3 countries, and many others, experiencing similar dynamics, the common thread is not the specific events that triggered their crises, but the sequence in which those events unfolded. Each case reflects a pattern where economic strain leads to political instability, external pressures magnify internal challenges, and attempts to restore balance come too late or lack the structural depth needed for lasting recovery. When viewed together, they form a mosaic that mirrors the historical progression of stage 4 across different eras and regions, reinforcing the idea that the global system today is moving through a familiar and increasingly recognizable phase. As these national examples reveal the visible symptoms of stage 4, the deeper mechanisms driving the cycle become even more apparent when we examine how modern economic power structures operate. Unlike past civilizations, today's nations are deeply entangled in a global web of financial institutions, multinational corporations, and political alliances that amplify every shift in the cycle. This interconnectedness allows governments and central banks to prolong certain stages through intervention, manipulation, or strategic policy decisions, but it also creates new vulnerabilities that previous eras did not face. The balance between control and instability becomes increasingly delicate as states attempt to influence outcomes that are fundamentally shaped by broader historical forces. One of the most striking aspects of the modern cycle is the role of monetary policy. Central banks around the world rely on tools like interest rate adjustments, quantitative easing, and currency management to stabilize their economies. While these measures can provide temporary relief, they often distort underlying market signals, pushing the system further from equilibrium. When interest rates are kept artificially low to stimulate growth, for example, debt levels rise, asset bubbles form, and long-term structural issues are concealed beneath a layer of manufactured stability. Eventually, the accumulated pressure becomes too great, exposing the fragility that was hidden during periods of intervention. Governments also participate in this dynamic by using fiscal strategies to influence public perception and maintain political support. Subsidies, public spending, and short-term economic boosts can create an illusion of progress, but they rarely address the fundamental issues fueling the cycle's progression. As a result, nations often find themselves trapped between the desire to project strength and the reality of declining productivity, rising inequality, and weakening institutions. These contradictions become especially visible during times of international tension, when global power blocs use economic influence, sanctions, and strategic alliances to reshape the geopolitical landscape in their favor. Another powerful force shaping the cycle is the rise of global financial markets. Investment flows can shift the fate of an entire nation in a matter of days, driven not by local conditions, but by global sentiment, speculation, or the actions of major financial actors. For countries already experiencing stage 4 pressures, these fluctuations can accelerate the slide into deeper instability. Capital flight, currency devaluation, and reduced access to international credit become catalysts that amplify domestic challenges, pushing nations closer to the next stages of the cycle. All of these mechanisms reveal how modern economic manipulation, whether intentional or structural, creates a complex environment where cycles can be stretched, distorted, or accelerated. Yet, despite these attempts to control outcomes, the deeper pattern continues to unfold, shaped by the same forces that have guided the rise and fall of societies throughout history. As these forces interact, the consequences of stage 4 begin to spill beyond national borders and shape the global environment in ways that are difficult to reverse. This phase is not simply about economic tension. It reshapes currencies, trade systems, resource flows, and geopolitical alliances all at once. The weakening of trust in financial institutions leads to volatility in foreign exchange markets, where currencies that once symbolized stability begin to fluctuate in unpredictable patterns. Investors react by seeking safer assets, which drains liquidity from vulnerable economies and places additional strain on already fragile systems. This shift transforms what might have remained a domestic issue into a global signal of instability. At the same time, commodity markets become increasingly reactive to shifts in supply and demand. Energy prices rise and fall with greater intensity. Food shortages become more frequent, and the cost of essential imports grows as currencies weaken. These pressures expose the dependence of nations on external resources, revealing vulnerabilities that were less visible during earlier stages of the cycle. Countries that rely heavily on imports face greater difficulty maintaining social stability, while exporters must navigate a landscape where demand can collapse unexpectedly. This instability sends shockwaves across global supply chains, affecting industries far removed from the original source of disruption. The political consequences of Stage 4 are equally significant. As economic pressures intensify, governments struggle to maintain legitimacy. Public protests, ideological polarization, and rising dissatisfaction fuel political fragmentation, making coherent long-term planning increasingly difficult. Power vacuums emerge, inviting external actors to assert influence through loans, aid programs, or strategic alliances that carry hidden costs. Nations caught in this network of competing interests become arenas where global powers test their influence, often deepening internal divisions rather than resolving them. Over time, these dynamics converge into a broader pattern visible across continents. It becomes clear that Stage 4 is not a local crisis, but a global realignment of power, resources, and economic stability. Countries that once served as anchors in the international system now show signs of strain while emerging. Nations attempt to capitalize on the uncertainty. This period of shifting influence creates an environment where unexpected alliances form, old assumptions crumble, and the next stage of the cycle draws closer with growing momentum. Before we continue, share in the comments what global consequences of Stage 4 you find most evident today, or which shifts in currencies, commodities, or political alliances seem most revealing to you, because your perspective helps expand the understanding of this complex turning point. As these global pressures intensify, major powers begin to treat Stage 4 not as a threat to be avoided, but as an opportunity to reposition themselves within a shifting international hierarchy. This phase becomes a strategic arena where influence is renegotiated, alliances are recalibrated, and long-standing assumptions about global leadership are quietly rewritten. Nations with strong economic foundations, advanced technological capabilities, or significant military leverage use this period of instability to expand their reach, often through subtle forms of influence rather than direct confrontation. The tactics may vary, but the objective remains consistent: to secure a stronger position before the next phase of the cycle reshapes the world even further. One of the most visible strategies involves the use of financial influence. Powerful countries extend credit, negotiate preferential trade deals, and acquire strategic assets in regions experiencing economic strain. These moves are typically framed as partnerships, but they often shift the balance of power in ways that benefit the stronger nation. As vulnerable economies accept external assistance, they become more dependent on the interests and policies of those providing support. Over time, this dependency shapes political decisions, resource distribution, and foreign policy alignment, creating a landscape where influence is exercised through economic leverage rather than overt force. Technological dominance also plays a critical role in how major powers navigate Stage 4. Nations at the forefront of innovation extend their reach through digital infrastructure, telecommunications networks, and data-driven systems. Control over these technological pathways grants them access to information, market influence, and strategic advantages that were unimaginable in earlier eras of the economic cycle. As countries in decline become more reliant on foreign technology, their autonomy weakens, reinforcing the power of those driving the global digital ecosystem. Military presence, while less visible than in the past, remains another pillar of influence during this stage. Strategic bases, security agreements, and defense partnerships allow major powers to project stability or exert pressure when necessary. These arrangements often emerge in regions where economic fragility intersects with geopolitical importance. The combination of military cooperation and financial support creates a dual mechanism through which great powers maintain control over critical regions. As these strategies unfold, the global order becomes increasingly fluid. Old alliances lose relevance, new blocs emerge, and nations caught between competing interests must navigate a landscape where every decision carries long-term consequences. This period of recalibration reveals how Stage 4 acts as both a test and an opportunity for great powers, offering them the chance to reshape the international system in their favor before the next stage of the cycle arrives with even greater intensity. As the influence of major powers reshapes the global landscape, another dimension of Stage 4 becomes increasingly visible, the emergence of hidden patterns that signal what comes next. These patterns are not immediately obvious in daily news headlines, yet they reveal themselves when economic, political, and social trends are viewed together across longer periods. Analysts who study historical cycles often point out that the transition from Stage 4 to the final phases is marked by a combination of stress, adaptation, and strategic realignment. While each nation experiences this progression differently, the underlying sequence remains remarkably similar across eras and continents. One of the clearest indicators lies in the behavior of currencies. As economies weaken, currencies tend to lose value not only because of internal instability, but also due to shifting global perceptions. Investors begin to anticipate future risks, adjusting their strategies in ways that accelerate the devaluation. This slow erosion of purchasing power affects everything else: trade balances, access to international credit, and the ability of governments to maintain essential services. Over time, these pressures reveal which countries are likely to stabilize and which are moving closer to the next, more disruptive stages of the cycle. Another revealing pattern appears in the restructuring of supply chains and resource flows. When nations sense growing instability, they begin to secure critical materials, diversify suppliers, and fortify sectors essential to national security. These moves signal an awareness that the system may be heading toward deeper disruption. Countries with strong strategic foresight adapt early, using the uncertainty of Stage 4 to prepare for the volatility that typically defines the later phases. Those that fail to act often find themselves exposed to shortages, trade, shocks, and geopolitical pressure that magnify internal weaknesses. Social dynamics also provide important clues about the trajectory towards Stage 5 and 6. Rising public frustration, the decline of institutional trust, and the spread of alternative narratives reflect a society grappling with uncertainty. As people lose confidence in traditional structures, they seek new explanations and new forms of leadership. These shifts, while subtle at first, create an environment ripe for major political transformations. Historically, such moments often precede abrupt changes in governance, economic restructuring, or shifts in national identity that redefine the course of a nation. Taken together, these patterns form a roadmap that helps interpret where the global system may be heading. They do not provide exact timelines or guarantee specific outcomes, but they reveal the structural pressures that shape the progression of every economic cycle. And as these signals become more pronounced, the transition toward the final stages grows harder to dismiss, forming the backdrop for the next turning point that will reshape the balance of power once again. As these signals intensify, the world approaches the final stretch of the economic cycle, where the real transformation begins to take shape. Stage 5 and Stage 6 are not simply periods of decline or reconstruction. They represent the moments when old structures finally give way to something new. This shift is rarely clean or predictable. It unfolds through a mixture of financial recalibration, political reshuffling, technological disruption, and social reinvention. Nations that adapt with clarity and strategic discipline find themselves emerging with renewed strength, while others struggle to reorganize their institutions and priorities. What makes this transition so defining is not the turbulence itself, but how countries respond to it. Throughout history, the late stages of the cycle have brought about changes that reshaped global power dynamics for generations. As currencies weaken and systems face increasing strain, new economic models begin to surface. Innovations that were previously overlooked or resisted suddenly become essential tools for survival. Political movements gain momentum, industries reorganize, and societies reconsider what stability and progress mean in a world that no longer resembles the one they knew a generation earlier. These moments of disruption are also moments of opportunity, where a shift in direction can determine the future course of entire regions. In the present global context, many of the developments we see today align with the structural pressures that define the final stages. Nations are reassessing alliances, accelerating technological transition, and seeking greater control over critical resources. At the same time, public expectations are evolving, pushing leaders to adapt to a world where traditional promises no longer resonate. The path ahead is filled with uncertainty, but it follows a rhythm that history has repeated countless times. By understanding this rhythm, it becomes possible to recognize the forces that will shape the next era of global order and anticipate the movements that emerge as power redistributes across the world. As we continue from here, it is worth reflecting on how these late-stage dynamics influence not just nations, but individual lives, decisions, and expectations. The more clearly we see the structure of the cycle, the more prepared we become to understand the changes unfolding around us. And since you have stayed with this analysis all the way to this point, you can share in the comments a short phrase like, "This message was for me," or "I followed until the end," because it helps me understand how far the audience is engaging with this discussion. If the content has been useful or expanded your perspective, you can also consider subscribing so you do not miss the next chapters of this exploration. And leave a like to support the continuation of studies like this. There is another video here on the side that connects directly with everything we discussed, so you can continue the analysis from there and keep expanding your understanding of how these cycles shape the world we live in.